Hello everyone, I'm Nishan from Verite Research, and we recently ran a campaign with a hashtag called Ask Verite. And you sent us a bunch of questions. My team collected them and asked me to answer them for you. Now in part one, we answered a few of those questions, and this is part two when I get to answering a few more of the questions that you sent us. But Ruki Jaratna asks quite a complex question, I can see. If Sri Lanka paid higher interest rates because we are already B- or whatever, and I think he means the credit rating agencies place us at a B- credit rating at some point, should that have already compensated for default or late payment, restructuring that is? What is the meaning of a high rate if the borrower's risk is not absorbed by the lender? I think behind that question is a question of reasonability, and also how we should think about debt restructuring and whether it's okay to default. So Sri Lanka has been borrowing at much higher rates than other countries because actually when we got into B- we couldn't borrow, but even when our rating was B, those ratings signal to investors a sense of risk that this country is not so sure that we are not so sure they will pay back their debt. And the way the investors compensate for that risk is they say, well, then we'll lend to you if we can get a high interest rate. So by chance, if you don't pay us back, we kind of get covered. And I think that's what the question is asking. Aren't they already covered by us when we don't pay them back? So the way to do that math really, one, we can say, well, how much more did we pay? And the way we measure it is we talk about a risk-free rate. It's not really risk-free, but the lowest risk rate usually is thought of as the US government treasuries. And just to give you a sense of the premiums that people pay, so when you're at a B rating, you're paying about 5 to 6% percentage points more than you would pay for a US government treasury. Right? So you have to pay that much extra to get people to give you money, or they think, look, the risk is not worth it. But when you get to B-, you probably have to pay over 15% above the US Treasury rates, which is why you say you're effectively locked out of the market, that you can't borrow. Those are rates at which it doesn't make sense to borrow in US dollars. But having paid that 6% more, when you get into trouble, that's why we say it's okay if you're in serious trouble and you can't repay debt, then it is all right to stop debt repayments and tell your creditors, look, we need to restructure this debt, because in a sense, they already understood that risk. That's why they asked for a high interest rate and they got it. And at the end of that restructure, if they are walking off with the same amount that they would have gotten even after you do all these reductions, if they had invested in US treasuries, actually they are almost better off. Because, if they had invested in US treasuries, they got that low rate for a sure thing. Here they took a risk, and for a while they got paid these high returns, and now on what's left over, they're still going to get what they would have got in US treasuries. So when you're smart about restructuring, you make sure that you give a deep enough haircut, that you restructure the debt downwards adequately to compensate for the fact that you've had to pay higher rates for a long time, and those people investing with you knew the risk they were taking, and that overall they've taken a benefit, they will also take a cost, and that cost has to really cut a little deep for the reasonability criteria to kick in here. So I think the way I see this question is saying, well, this is why it is reasonable to give a deep haircut, because people who lend to you profited greatly by taking a risk. And when the risk comes to roost, they should take the cost too. Let me take the sixth question by a handle called VRYA22. What lessons can Sri Lanka learn from previous debt crises in other countries, and how can these lessons inform the country's approach to debt restructuring? I think that there are two lessons worth thinking about right now in debt restructuring. And the first caution as we think about debt restructuring is that one of the most important things for countries that get into trouble is that it is a good idea to get out of it decisively and sustainably. Say you're a business, you do quite well, the banks lend to you, you get into trouble. You go to the banks and say, hey guys, I'm in trouble. I need to restructure my loans to you, and they might do it and give you another chance and be happy to work with you. 2 years later, you do that again, that can really be scarring, right? Suddenly you might become seen as a country that is completely unreliable. And of course, that's going to then impact the rates at which you borrow too, even though one debt restructuring can do that. But if you can show that through the restructuring, you can come out in a way that you have a sustainable future ability to repay the debt, then your damage is minimal. And when we look at the history of countries that restructured debt from 1975 to 2022, actually 59% of the countries that restructured debt did it more than once. Only 41 got away doing it just once. So the critical thing for Sri Lanka now, and the lesson to learn, is to say, well, what about countries that did it once? How are they different from countries that did it twice? And there are two differences. One we see is governance. So the world, there's an indicator for governance that the World Bank actually puts out, and that shows a startling correlation, almost a perfect correlation between countries with governance indicators that are significantly high, that restructure only once, and countries with governance indicators below that lot that restructure twice. Sri Lanka is kind of in between. Sri Lanka's governance is worse than all the countries that have restructured once, but better in the governance indicators of the World Bank than most countries that have restructured twice or more. So one way to think about it is where Sri Lanka's governance goes, its restructuring sustainability might go also. That if Sri Lanka improves governance, this might get us into ending up doing it once. If the governance declines, you might end up doing it more than once and get yourself again into trouble. But there's a second indicator. Usually countries that do it once do deep restructuring. They ask their creditors to take deep haircuts, deep reductions in the debt that's owed to them. And by deep, I mean capital haircuts, interest rate haircuts, grace periods, or reprofiling. So they bunch it up in a way that the cost to the creditor is quite high, but in a way, having that high cost today means the creditor has confidence about you tomorrow. Sometimes you can please the creditor today by giving them a low restructuring, a low haircut, but if they see you is at risk in terms of paying back tomorrow, they will take their money and run. They won't come back without high interest rates. So just like in 2021, 21, 22, Sri Lanka kept saying, we don't want to default because we don't want our creditors to lose faith in us, and kept repaying our creditors when we should have stopped repaying the debt. None of those guys ever came back and agreed to lend to us just because we repaid them, because they knew we were not in a situation to take. They took their money and ran. So in this restructuring, the creditors will take their money and run, and it doesn't help Sri Lanka's cause if the restructuring isn't deep enough to make it sustainable. So improved governance and a deep restructure is the path to being sustainable, and that is the lesson that Sri Lanka can learn from other countries. Oh, there's one last question. It is, what will the dollar rate be at the end of the year? So, of course, this is $1 million question, literally. There's a lot of money to be made if you can predict that well. And it is a question that many of our paid clients ask us during our macroeconomic briefings. But instead of trying to answer that question, let me sort of say, how do you think about the calculation? Do I want to convert my dollars to rupees? Or do I want to convert my rupees to dollars? How do I decide? So here's the way you think about it. You're concerned not only about how much the rupee might depreciate against the dollar or appreciate against the dollar. So let's say you thought that the rupee will depreciate against the dollar by 5%. Okay, that today the rupee is 320 to a dollar or 330. Maybe it'll be 345 or 47 by the end of the year. So this can be an expectation in 1 year's time. So maybe you have that expectation. But does that mean you should hold your money in dollars and not convert it to rupees? Actually, it doesn't mean that. Just because the rupee depreciates, it doesn't mean that the dollar is better. The real calculation is to ask yourself, well, what is the interest rate I get on the dollar? So let's assume you can get a 5% interest rate on the dollar. So if you get 5% interest rate on the dollar depreciates against the rupee at 5%, you're, in a sense, bring the dollar back later gives you a 10% return on the rupee. But maybe if you convert it into the rupee now and had it in rupees, you can put it in a fixed deposit and get 15%. So clearly, even though the rupee is depreciating against the dollar, you might be much better off being in the rupee, because the interest rate differential also matters, not only the rate of depreciation. So that's a little bit of financial and saving advice. I hope you enjoyed our discussion of Ask Verite that we've done for you today. And please feel free to explore the handle and send more questions whenever you want. Thank you so much.